Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this joint GGA CDD webinar titled Reflections on Military Operations in Cabo Delgado. My name is Chris Maruleng, and I am Executive Director of the think tank Good Governance Africa. Maybe I can just share a few words about Good Governance Africa. We are an applied policy research think tank that is based in Rosebank, Johannesburg, South Africa, where we focus on issues related to governance across the continent. In a nutshell, very quickly, we define governance as that question, that important question in any society or community, which asks the question of who gets what, when, and how. It's really about the authoritative allocation of resources. My colleague, Professor Adriano Novunga, is going to, at a later stage, introduce the work of the CDD and what they stand for. But let me start off by giving a very brief summary of what brings us here together to this webinar. As most of you would be aware, over the past few weeks, troops from South Africa, Botswana, and other states within the region have arrived in Mozambique as part of the Southern African Development Community's standby force deployment to combat terrorism and acts of violent extremism in Cabo Delgado, which has plagued northern Mozambique since about the year 2017. And this intervention has really been at the request of the Mozambican government. Rwanda, interestingly enough, has also deployed a 1,000-person contingent of the Rwanda Defense Forces and the Rwanda National Police to Cabo Delgado, helping to shift the balance of power in the province and allow for the government to, interestingly, retake the strategically important town of Musimbao de Praia, which has been under insurgent control since around the year 2020, that is around August 2020. Both the United States and the European Union have also committed to provide training and capacity building to Mozambican security forces. So Mozambique faces a significant challenge to ensure military forces from the region and indeed the international community deliver a coherent and coordinated operation and training in this fight against violent extremism in Cabo Delgado. This is particularly important as we are faced with having to view the withdrawal of United States forces and NATO forces from Afghanistan. So we'll be asking some interesting questions about whether there are some lessons or comparisons that we can draw from this recent withdrawal in Afghanistan. And we'll also centrally be focused on addressing questions around how we can address issues related to accountability of the forces, whether there's an opportunity to see the establishment of a peacefully negotiated solution. And in essence, what are the success factors that will define a successful deployment into Mozambique? So, having said that, let me tell you a little bit about the panelists who joined me today to basically help us unpack. I indicated that my colleague from the CDD, which is the Center for Democratic Development in Mozambique, Prof. Adriano Novunga, joins me and will be assisting with the framing and indeed a quick introduction. He will be followed by Professor Abel Esterhuizy, who is the head of Department of Strategic Studies at the Faculty of Military Sciences at the Stellenbosch University. And then we will have also joining us Professor Erin McCandless, who is Associate Professor of Peace and Security at Wits University. Then finally, we hope also to be joined at a later stage by Professor Thomas Mandrup, who is from the Security Institute for Governance and Leadership, and that is also at Stellenbosch University. We will wrap up and have Professor Nvunga at the end of it, after a quick moderated discussion, giving us his final reflections and what he believes are the key takeouts of the discussion that we would have held today. So, with that said, and without further ado, let me hand over to my friend and my brother, Professor Adriano Nvunga, for your opening remarks, sir.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you very much, distinguished panelists, for being together this afternoon. This is one of a series of events that we, CDD and GGA, together with Men and Guardian, will jointly organize. And this, it results of the concern that we have. We as CDD is Mozambique's civil society organization working on governance, democracy, and human rights, with particular focus on peace and security. CDD is concerned with growing militarization of Cabo Delgado. After initial reluctance, Mozambique authorities have opened doors for regional troops. On the one hand, as Chris have indicated, we have the Rwandan Defense Forces in the ground, and which are operating relatively less transparently, as it is not clear as to which mandate under which they are operating in Mozambique. And on the other hand, we have the SADC deployment, which it results of a clear mandate from SADC. Initially, we had believed that any other countries outside from SADC willing to intervene in Mozambique would come under the banner of SADC, but that is not the reality. The Rwanda's defense troops were given relatively preference, quickly deploy and quickly take positions in northern Cabo Delgado, and have, together with the Mozambique Defense Forces, been in the forefront of fighting violent extremism there. Our concern is with the safety and security of the large number of non-combatants, mainly women and children, particularly those who are held captive by violent extremists in Cabo Delgado. As an offensive operation by continental now and regional forces increases in the coming weeks, it will be crucial to ensure that international obligations are met to ensure the safety of non-combatants. And here is, on the one hand, the issue of how the regional forces and the continental forces are ensuring the security of non-combatants. But on the other hand, is the issue of the international humanitarian law. And this speaks to the issue of accountability. And particular concern here is not only with respect to human rights, but also it results from what we have seen from other parts of Africa, where similar missions or deployments, they have gained a life of their own, and where deployments, they started to engage in activities way beyond the initial mandate that they have. So it is in this context that we see the growing militarization of Cabo Delgado, the issue of coordination of these deployments, given Mozambique's relative weak capacity to steer different deployments with different cultures, different trainings, different disciplines, etc., and the structures of governance that CDD, GGA, and the Mail and Guardian have come together to organize this webinar as an important event when we, number one, aim at drawing the public attention to the issue of militarization, reflect on what is happening and how Mozambique can learn from other parts of Africa and the world on how to go about it in order to ensure that what is aimed at assisting Mozambique, it will not result on feeding into the root causes that have led where we are today. So this is the overall context, and the framing is really about reflecting on the militarization of Cabo Delgado and how different stakeholders can help to frame a public discourse and awareness on how Mozambique can move forward in a way that the military intervention result, as I've indicated, and in fueling the problems. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Asteri to
Esther Hasty.
Abel Esteri to give his keynote address. And thank you very much.
Hi, Prof. We can see your presentation now. Thank you. I believe you're on mute, Prof.
Sorry.
We can hear you now, yes.
Okay, sorry for that. What I want to do is to ask some critical questions about both the idea of an insurgency and the idea of a military solution in Cabo Delgado. And I want to raise it as sort of reason or as a means to get debate on going amongst us about the military deployment. So I want to start off by taking stock of the realities that we are facing in that particular problems. It's a typical complex emergency, and it used to be a huge ungoverned space, and for a very long time we had a need for good governance in Cabo Delgado. And in many ways, it was what I want to call a Wild West scenario in that part of the country. Everyone is basically exploiting the situation for his own interest and fending for him himself. And then you need to tie that to deep-rooted smuggle networks, both in and out of the country, and then the discovery of large quantities of natural gas. And of course, development and money brings with it a conglomerate of strange actors to the table, both legitimate and illegitimate. And so you have to manage the expectations of these various groups, and then you feed into that the role of the Mozambican security forces and private military companies. But for me, the critical question here is that into this complex emergency, we're now adding an alliance and an uncoordinated military force. And perhaps it is time for us to reflect critically on why we are bringing this military force into this emergency and what will be the implications of doing that. And are we not going to add more complexity to an already complex situation? So if you then look at it from a military situation, from a military perspective, and specifically a campaign planning perspective, where military commanders have to look at the geography, the time and space issues, of course, you're sitting with a very large area in the northeastern part of Mozambique, and it immediately raises questions in terms of the force and space ratio of the forces that we have deployed into that area. It's sort of almost a drop in the ocean. Sorry for that. And you add to that the reality that you have to look at the borders in order to isolate the area of operations. And you're sitting with an international border with Tanzania, you're sitting with a sea border or a maritime border, and you sit with provincial borders. And a military commander will have to manage those borders if you want to be effective in setting up a counterinsurgency campaign, and it immediately brings the maritime domain into play. And then if you look at the nature of the geographical nature of the province in terms of development, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of towns and population centers, in terms of the economy, in terms of the historical presence of Islam, you want to ask questions about whether the military will really be able to dominate the area and whether we will really be with the forces that are deployed into that area at the moment, both the Rwandan forces and the SADC forces, whether we will really be able to actually do what is required and what needs to be done in that province at the moment. If you look at the other side of the hill and what is required from insurgents to get to keep the insurgency going, well, for them it's a case of an attack once in a blue moon, and for them it's a case of sort of setting up a legitimate core message that resonates with the population in general. But, and this is a very important but, any insurgency requires some form of institutional and bureaucratic capacity. And that bureaucratic and institutional capacity normally is rooted to a safe haven, preferably a trans-border safe haven, to build the insurgent capacity, or then a safe haven within the area of operations where they are relatively free from interference from the counterinsurgency forces. Also, most insurgent campaigns rely on some form of international support, especially in terms of logistics. And then, of course, they need to have infrastructural, institutional, and the ability to sustain the campaign with weapon systems, with personnel over time. And of course, you need some support from the local population. And terror for support is useful, as Mao sort of told us, but it is not really useful for a long, sustainable campaign. So where does this leave us in terms of the insurgency? Are we looking here at an insurgency that is really sustainable over a period of time? It's a critical question that we need to answer here. Looking at it from a counterinsurgency campaign perspective, I want to make use of James Curris's sort of three-phased approach in looking at counterinsurgency, and he's sort of demarcating three key processes that needs to unfold in any counterinsurgency campaign. The first is location. You ought to locate and identify the insurgent, and that requires predominantly an intelligence and police-driven campaign. And it requires a campaign that is closely tied into the cultural and religious realities in the specific area of operations. But the point I want to make here is that militaries are often damaging and unhelpful in this phase of the campaign. The second phase, of course, is to isolate the insurgent from its support, both the external and internal safe havens. And you do that predominantly through a Hearts and Minds campaign, a comprehensive approach, good governance, and very important, by providing a sustainable alternative for the population. And then lastly is, of course, the most military-driven phase of the operation, which boils down to the eradication, the physical annihilation of the insurgents, where the military sort of comes into play. But once again, the point that I want to make here is that the military is in place, and what are we busy with in Cabo Delgado at the moment? Have we gone through the process of location and isolation? And are we now at a point where we can start with the eradication process? If we are not, we are setting ourselves up for big problems. So let me talk a little bit about those problems. Alliances are traditionally not very good in fighting counterinsurgency wars, and we've just seen that in Afghanistan, playing out in Afghanistan. So your lead nation concept is critical if you want to do counterinsurgency good. But you cannot do counterinsurgency without good governance, the so-called comprehensive approach. And if you don't do good governance, and if you don't come with a comprehensive approach, your military action, in fact, is doomed. And if you then add to that the problem of time and space, that it's probably going to take a lot of time, it's going to take a lot of forces, and that you need to get the right force and force ratios in place. It is not a matter that can be done with a small token force, because you need sustainable operations over a period of time and that are set up for the space in which you want to operate. So here we are sitting with SADC and forces from Rwanda. And the underlying question is, how are we going to coordinate these forces, and whose interests are they serving at the moment? Do we have a coherence? Do we have an alignment of interest here, or are we looking at different interests from these military forces? So it raises questions about the ability of external military forces to successfully intervene in complex emergencies, precisely what we've seen in the last month or so playing out in Afghanistan. And then the last question that I want to raise, and I think we need to talk about, is the issue of a military end state. And I think this is the most fundamental question, is what would be the end state that the military is looking for in Mozambique? how does success looks like from a military perspective? How will the military know that they have achieved their objective? In other words, how does the military visualize success in Mozambique? What is the picture they have in their heads of success, of military success in Mozambique? And then we need to be able to tie that military end state to the political end state, because eventually, if you're not looking at a political solution, your military solution is doomed by implication. I draw the line there.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your fantastic observations. Very thought-provoking, particularly moved by your use of Kiras's framework for counterinsurgency operations: locate, isolate, and effectively eradicate. I think probably what is challenging for non-military people like us, who focus more on governance questions, is whether indeed the military option can ever lead to any form of success without addressing the grievances of the people on the ground. But I'm quite sure we'll hear from others in this regard, and I'd like to invite Prof. Erin McCandless to make her opening remarks and enter into our conversation. Prof. McCandless, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm stimulated by much of what was just said, but I'm going to try and maintain my focus and keep to my 10 minutes. So I've been asked to go in a bit of a different direction and to talk about the peace building and development dimensions of the issue. And so I'll start by just emphasizing that violent extremism is often a symptom of state fragility and the breakdown of social cohesion. And we know that it tends to take root in marginalized areas where the state is not adequately attending to the needs and grievances of communities, which are then easily mobilized, and particularly amongst young people who see themselves without much of a future. And there's wide consensus that we can't solve violent extremism with hard security only. And this is globally and also in Cabo Delgado. If we look at Afghanistan, $2 trillion was spent by the US military. And we can ask ourselves, what if that money was instead spent on improving public services and local governance capacity? So I would argue that we need to have an approach rooted in peace building, governance, and development, which are at the heart of sustaining peace and preventing further conflict, or in approaches that we call preventing violent extremism. Obviously, it can't be prevented, it's already underway, but many of these approaches tie together to talk about a more holistic engagement to dealing with the issue. So the key challenge, however, is that while there's much enthusiasm for these types of approaches, the political will to address root causes, which is at the heart of prevention and sustaining peace, is often lacking. And security-oriented solutions are unlikely to inspire leaders to move towards a political solution and to address root causes. So research by UNDP on those who've joined violent extremist groups in Africa has revealed a strong sense of economic marginalization and lack of trust in governments that they are experiencing. For example, 83% believe that the government only looks after the interests of a few, and over 75% have zero trust in politicians or law enforcement. And this reveals state fragility, which is reflecting a state's weak capacity to carry out basic functions, manage risks, and develop a trusted relationship with society. Of the 10 states that are most affected by terrorism, 8 have high levels of fragility. And Mozambique has had a steady rising fragility score. So for example, the Fragile States Index, if we consider that, in 2006, Mozambique was ranked 80th. The 80th most fragile country globally, and today it's 22nd of 179 countries. So I think we have to think about security-oriented solutions not being able to address root causes, which are complex and multifaceted and stem from a mix of historical, political, social, psychological, push and pull factors, such as grievances around economic and political exclusion on the one hand, and ideology and material benefits that transform grievances into violent extremist action on the other. So in Cabo Delgado, there is broad agreement that the uprising started with young people in the majority Muslim region with predictable grievances about economic marginalization and lack of jobs and lack of security sector and human rights abuses, and linked the lack of benefits from the vast mineral resources in the region, including rubies and gas, and poor resettlement processes that took place around these. So the gas company Total, kind of at the heart of a lot of the discussions right now, has yet to start extracting gas, which will take place in 2023, as expected to. And so the investments that were expected have been stalled due to the conflict, aggravating grievances from previous experiences with mining companies. So the state has little administrative reach or security presence in the area, which has allowed the insurgency to take root and is an indicator of high state fragility. Again, thinking about fragility indicators, the highest fragility indicators are in uneven development, which is inequality, and public services. So Mozambique scores 9.2 and 9.9 out of 10 being the highest fragility in these areas, which is shocking. And despite its natural resource wealth, the region has the poorest human development in the country, wielding huge illicit economy, as the last speaker spoke to, in gems and wildlife, drugs, which has corrupted local officials in many cases and creates distrust amongst the population. And decentralization, seen as quite key in Mozambique, despite policy agreement around it, is sluggish and politicized, and communities have a lack of voice and participation as well. So critically, the question of why the Mozambique government did not act sooner on this insurgency is a very critical question being asked by many people. So what to do moving forward? There's little disagreement on the need for a security approach at this point and for external assistance to stem the advances of insurgents, given the context of a very weak security sector in the country. And on this front, I agree with much of international crisis groups' analysis on the value of the need for targeted assistance to support security operations and the need to avoid heavy external deployments that might fuel complexity and intractability, as well as the need for regional action to strengthen law enforcement, to block transnational jihadist involvement, dialogue with militants. But we also know that more is needed to achieve peace and to sustain it than silencing the guns, so to speak. Moving beyond counterterrorism measures, which are rooted in hard security, towards an approach targeting sustainability and prevention, rather, puts a lens on analysis of the political economy and conflict context, including the enablers, as I spoke about, and push and pull factors of recruitment, measures to support de-radicalization and the building of resilience capacities within communities to recover and to prevent future radicalization, recruitment and mobilization, and also a focus on addressing root causes, and in particular the structural root causes, and building state capacity to address all of these. We might ask, what is sustaining peace? And for me, this is very much linked to the notion of success. And for the UN right now, sustaining peace and conflict prevention is probably the top priority, backed by twin General Assembly and Security Council resolutions from 2016, and it really talks about building that sustaining peace is a process of building a common vision in society with activities aimed at preventing the outbreak, escalation, continuation, and recurrence of the conflict. And again, doing this in a very holistic manner with a focus on addressing root causes. And sustaining peace, I would also argue, requires mending or forging an inclusive and resilient social contract, in particular the vertical dimension, the state-society contract, and tying a political solution to agreements around that are inclusive and participatorily developed and nationally owned and locally owned policies. And this must involve talking to young people. In Africa, 75% of the young people 75% of the population are young people, and young people are unfortunately at the heart of many of the violent extremist movements. So we can see how important this is. Secondly, a social contract requires ensuring institutions are functioning, serving people in fair and effective ways. And the indicators I just spoke about show that this is an extreme issue in Mozambique. And then third, around building social cohesion, both horizontally between communities, but especially between the state and its institution, and in particular around the security sector, where there is a very strong sense of mistrust that paves the way for attraction to terrorist narratives. And I think running through all of these elements is the need for really building political and economic exclusion that cuts across these areas. And concerted attention needs to be based on people-centered, decentralized approaches to resolving the issues. This is key for addressing this illicit economy, really making people part of the solution rather than the problem. I'm not quite sure why Mozambique has not done a national action plan for preventing violent extremism. And this is a UN initiative that many countries around the world have undertaken. And equally, there should be a regional action plan as well, bringing in regional states and neighbors. And then attention to improving natural resource governance. I mean, this is a resource-cursed country, clearly. And the opportunities to transform the national economy need to be harnessed with this impressive national resource wealth, but they have to be better managed. And in particular, putting community benefit at the top of the list of really thinking this through. And there's very good policies in place in terms of giving 2.75% of mining revenues to local communities, but there's complaints that these are not reaching local levels, that this money is not reaching. And there's also exciting developments. I mean, lots of money flowing in now, which is positive in terms of like $100 million World Bank grant focusing for the region, focusing on social cohesion, access to basic services, public infrastructure, restoring livelihoods. And this is just the first part of a $7 million grant, as I understand it. And this is supposed to flow through the government's integrated development agency. However, there's already concerns being expressed around transparency and effectiveness of this institution. And critically, wider attention needs to be given to the state's extraordinary development challenges and state fragility as part of this process. So finally, I'll just say that, and I haven't said much about humanitarianism, but there's a lot to be said there as well. But humanitarian and development work must be done in ways that will support sustainability and prevention. And really, this means fostering well thought out and transparent decentralization processes with heightened attention to local governance capacity development, and ensuring that ensuring that conflict and environmentally sensitive interventions that promote resilience of local communities are at the core. And these, of course, factor context analysis. I mean, all of this that I've just spoken about into the planning and implementation of programming. And lastly, just underscoring the need for all of this to be done in highly inclusive ways, because people feel a strong sense of disengagement and grievance. And so there needs to be a strong attention to building this inclusive process, in particular engaging the youth in ways that build trust and a sense of belonging. Yeah, it's not a quick process. It'll take some time and need a lot of dedication. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor McCandless. That was very insightful. Particularly enjoyed how you really provided that segue between the security perspective that was also excellently described by Professor Esterhazy to really ask us to look at some of the fundamental governance questions about who gets what, when, and how. And that powerful opening statement where you say, we cannot solve violent extremism through security measures. Let's see, Prof. McCandless, if Professor Mandrup agrees with your assessment, or whether he might be coming up with a third way. Prof. Mandrup, welcome to our conversation. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Maybe you could switch on your camera.
I'm just trying to find this camera.
If you look above you near the microphone icon, it's the blue one on the extreme right-hand side. There you go. You are on.
Okay, thank you very much, and sorry for I'm in the park with my son, so that's where I'm at the moment. So, but thank you very much for giving me the time to participate in this, I think, critical seminar and a very critical stage. I think I will start in another place, and I think it's important when we talk about Mozambique, and especially in the last 2 years, which has been very sad to see the deterioration in what's happened, and also the increased number of the refugees and the attacks and all the images we say. We also, there's some good news, because if you look at the latest intelligence, Mozambique de Praia, which was the key town for the insurgents because of the history of the radical Islamic movement going 10, 15 years back in Mozambique, has been taken back by the Mozambican Rwandan forces, which is strategically important. Nechinga and Namakande local bases has been overrun. Certain bases have been overrun in the recent days, forcing the insurgents out of these safe havens and into certain other areas. I'm not saying that this is a victory, but I'm just saying that it illustrates that in terms of military, the insurgents are not a match for conventional military forces when they're faced heads on with well-organized forces. And that has been the biggest problem so far, has been that you have had a Mozambican defense force were not very well-trained, financed, badly managed, and that's been one of the biggest problems, and that's where the Rwandans can play an important role, and SADC can play an important role if we want to. But of course it raises other issues, because where are these insurgents then going? And if you talk to intelligence sources in Tanzania and Kenya, the big fright from their side is, of course, that these insurgents are moving back across the border into these regions. And we have, within last year, we've seen insurgent activity in the southern part of Tanzania, close to the border here, where the local communities have been targeted. So it's not something. Then we're back to what Abel, Professor Esterhuis, and also Erin tried to also talk about. This is the question around what is it that the military can do. Yeah, there's no military solution, but the military can create space for a political solution to take place. So we can force them. Abel used the word to annihilate the enemy. We can put the enemies too much under pressure that they have to see the advantage of trying to go into a political solution. But it requires that, which is my next point, it requires that you have local ownership and that you have a local government that actually wants to solve and go critically into this and constructively into this and deal with the root causes that Erin talked about. And that is maybe the biggest problem we've had so far, that Mozambican government has and it is a very direct critique here, has been very slow and been unwilling to actually address the core issues which were found in the region. Because this is going, as I mentioned initially, the internal struggles between different elements of Sufi orders and radicalized elements of especially Mozambique de Praia, but also to a certain extent in Palma, is not new. We knew that. We knew that the insurgents were organizing themselves. We saw local intercommunal strife back in 15, 16, but no one reacted, and the government didn't react because they were so focused on other stuff. And we come back to that. Then Abel mentioned the concept of ungoverned space. I would argue, I would actually turn it around. I'm actually, together with my colleague Francois Frey, we're actually publishing an anthology on ungoverned space in Africa and all that. But actually, what we often see when we talk about ungoverned space is not an ungoverned space. It's not that the state is not there. When I was in northern Mozambique in mid-2019, there were government forces, police, government officials all over. The question is what they're doing and how they're involved and how they react and how corrupt they are and how are they actually performing their tasks. So I think we have to turn, maybe it could be that we have actually an overstate presence. We have too much presence, especially of civilian and military security personnel that with impunity are part of the criminal networks that actually are active in these areas, which of course is causing the problem. So it's just to try to ask some critical questions around when we say ungoverned, what is ungoverned in reality? Then the next thing I would actually to move on to is the whole thing around coin. Can we win? What Abel asked the question, and which of course is the right one to ask, especially in terms of Afghanistan. I will come back to that in a moment. But when we talk about winning a coin operation, one basic thing, and then Buffer, the old French strategic thinker, back from his experiences from Algiers and from Vietnam, into China at that time, the French colony and all that. You cannot win if the local community do not buy into to the political model your project. And one question is that the Mozambicans have never, and the government has never tried in reality to sell the idea and project of how Cabo Delgado and the communities in Cabo Delgado are actually integrated into the state Mozambique and the project of Mozambique. And why I'm saying that is, if you go back to the independence days, Cabo Delgado has always played a critical role in being part of the anti-colonial struggle and all that, and they never really got the recognition for that. And they always been marginalized and all that. And that is also part of the issues we see now, that really the idea of actually solving this has never been addressed in a proper manner. Then finally, I think also we need to recognize, and we talk about knowledge, we talk about that Abel said this needs to be intelligence driven, we need to know what's going on and all that. And that of course is in a big issue here, because the Mozambican obviously they're not willing to share, or they haven't shared, or maybe they didn't know reality what was going on in the dynamics here. The other thing I would add to that is, of course, that we also need to see this as not just a civil war and an insurgency in Mozambique, but it's also an insurgency, a local civil war between communities in Cabo Delgado. And we've seen that with the increased number of vigilante groups being reignited and deployed as part of the operations up there, which of course is a good thing, can be an effective measure for short-term solutions, but for longer-term solutions, it's actually an expression of a weak state, and it's actually a very dangerous path to go down through. So we have to be very careful in that, and we also, when we go in and address, we need to be aware and take this into account. Then find that I have three more issues. When we talk about Mozambique, I think that's not been mentioned so much. But we all know this, that the former finance minister is in prison, accused of corruption cases. We had the EEC project that collapsed, which means now the Mozambique is caught with a debt of nearly 20 billion US dollars, and they have a lot of equipment now from that EEC project, going from radar stations on the coastline, shipyards, patrol boats of many different kinds, a fishing fleet, the tuna fish channel, all that, which the current government is implicated in. The current president was defense minister at the time that was decided. All these, most of these assets were bought and of course, with corruption and entrepreneuring, but also they are now lying on shore and are not operational at the moment, which of course illustrates the problems that Mozambique is faced with. That we have a country which is now going to pay for something with short-term loans they got from Credit Suisse and then the Russian Federal Bank and all that, and they need to pay that back. And the equipment they got, they paid too much for it, and they cannot be used right now. They haven't the capacity to run it, and they're faced with a problem where, as Abel said, we are faced with an insurgency where we have to take all into account, also the maritime space as well, which moves on to the next one. Of course, Iran mentioned it about the second largest investment project in Africa, the gas project in Mozambique, which of course, because of the attacks on Palma and also before that the attacks on Mozambique prior, that Total choose to close down. And again, it's not just 2023 now. They are waiting for a year, and they maybe come back, and they force majeure and all these kind of things, which of course put into doubt whether Mozambique are going to get that, and when Mozambique is going, if they are, and when are they going to get that kind of income from the gas extraction that everyone was hoped for? The whole idea of a whole new Kuwait. And that is one of we need to take that into account as well. The corruption around this, a lack of will to do this, and the problems if Mozambique do not get that. How do they finance this, and how do they deal with all the other issues they face with all this? I have mentioned the risk of spillover into the region, which of course explains very much why SADC needs to go into this, because this can be a bridgehead for a lot of other activities. If Islamic State is now is going to, we have already seen that in Eastern Congo with the ADF, and the risk, of course, we need to, as a local, as a regional organization and a region, need to address and put pressure on Mozambique to effectively do this. And again, the military can create space, but it requires the Mozambican government and local ownership to solve it, and only they can do it. We cannot do it for them from the outside. Finally, then there was a lot of people talk about Afghanistan, and of course, being a Dane, we lost 44 soldiers in Afghanistan over 20 years. We were in the worst places in Afghanistan, in the green zone in Helmand and stuff like that. And there's a lot of questions going on at the moment. Where did it go wrong? What was the problem here? And then basically one can say that it was a slippery slope from it too many ways, eh? Because what did this conflict start with? They started with fighting Al Qaeda in Torabora Mountains. That took 6 months, and then the pressure was there, and then someone was supposed to take over, and then they got ambitious. They wanted to create a democracy, a good governance after Western style, whatever. And as Abel mentioned when he had the presentation, it needs to be embedded into local structures and cultures and what is acceptable for the local community. And for instance, Afghanistan is a extremely conservative, religious, and they do not accept Western kind of democracy forced upon them from the outside. That's one thing. So we became overambitious, and already in 2013, when they changed the strategy, it was quite obvious that we'd strategically lost the conflict already. And then the next issue, and that's a question about ethics and morale. Martin van Crefeld once said that, the the Dutch Israeli strategist said, the West always loses counterinsurgency interventions because they do not do what is needed. And then he used the old Syrian president Assad's example, be brutal. So you surround a village, you kill off everyone, also the ones that can attack you afterwards. That, of course, is not acceptable for most democracies in the world. So that's not an option. Then the other time is time and soft power. And he always uses the example of the Brits in Northern Ireland. They decided they were not going to leave Northern Ireland, and they were going to be robust enough and patient enough and tried so they can in the end could find some kind of political solution. The problem we face with, and especially I think Afghanistan is a good example of that it became a political project, and when the political masters lost their appetite for this kind of projects, they withdrew. And then the question is, we never have the time. So if you don't have a partner that can actually deliver, so what kind of project? We need to be very realistic about what is possible. And in hindsight, would it have been better to move and leave Afghanistan after the initial 6 months? Maybe. Because now we have a Taliban that is stronger than ever. And as Erin said, we've been there for 20 years. And with all the negative consequences they've had on soldiers and civilians and financially and all that. So if that is a lesson for Mozambique, I think it is that we need to be able to stay on, and we need to not leave first thing. But I better stop here. There was a lot of questions and comments and issues for debate, I guess. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Mandrup. Some very provocative issues that you raise. I want to bring in very quickly Prof. Esterhuizen here. And this is really around the question of COIN or counterinsurgency operations. We heard earlier on Prof. McCandless kind of saying that, preventing violent extremism through security measures alone cannot work. We've also heard just now Prof. Mandrup saying, can a counterinsurgency approach, pure military one that you seemed to be advocating in Mozambique? Can it really work? Do you still maintain that it is something that should be pursued? Can it work, Prof. Esterhazy?
I am very cautious. So if my presentation have given the impression that I'm all in favor of a full-blown counter-insurgency campaign in Mozambique, well, that's the wrong impression. In fact, I'm deeply worried about the deployment of the SADC and Rwandan forces in Mozambique, and I'm worried because I am not 100% convinced, and Thomas touched on it, that the military have actually thought through the whole process of what the military is supposed to do in Mozambique. I got the impression, and I have the impression that perhaps we deployed the forces, but we never thought about how to employ them. And there's a huge difference between deployment and employment. And my question is really about how are we going to employ the forces in Cabo Delgado to be effective in doing what they are supposed to do. And I have serious questions about what the end state is that they envisioned. What is it that the military must do? What is it that they expect?
So, Prof,
the military to do?
Have you heard any definition of what the military objectives are, in particular of the Southern African Development Community's intervention force, SAMIM? Have you heard anything around those objectives? Have they been clearly articulated to you?
Well, I haven't seen anything, and I don't know whether Thomas has seen something on this, but I haven't seen much information. I hope they have thought through this and that they have a clear idea of what they want to do. But let me also say there's two critical issues here. I mean, we cannot do the development part if we don't have security. The question is, how do we go about establishing that security that is required? And a hardcore approach by the military is seldom a good way to establish that kind of security that is needed for development. You have to address the root causes of the problem in Mozambique. And then perhaps the second point that I need to make is about the fact that military forces always serves particular interests. Whose interest is Rwanda serving by intervening in Mozambique? What is the connections, if I can put it like that the Rwandan forces are bringing to the table with their deployment in Mozambique? Is there a French connection? If we look at the SADC forces, whose interests are they deploying with? Is it the South African interest? Is it SADC interest?
So Prof. Esterhazy, I'll come back to you. I want to bring in here Professor Novunga. You hear Prof. Esterhazy effectively saying, in whose interests is Rwanda acting on? Whose interests are the SAMIM operating on? Do you have any insights that you can share with us?
Thank you very much, my brother. Well, there are speculations as to who would be behind the Rwandese deployment. Some would say it is French, and you remember my president here. He traveled to Rwanda to discuss the matter precisely the week that you are supposed to convene the SADC Troika here, which was postponed after the report of the technical deployment was leaked. and subsequently he went to France to meet Macron and Total, and the speed at which the Rwandese deployment, and given the current positioning of the Rwandese troops in Mozambique, some would say that they are here one to clean and protect the LNG area, so to say, and less to do overall fighting against violent extremists. Recently, speculations suggest that the US also could be there using Rwandese to fight a proxy war. The reality, though, is up until now, the Rwandese have been relatively successful. One, they have repelled violent extremists. Not clear whether it's a military success or the violent extremists, they are pushing back and they will be running to other countries, including mingling with local communities. But the reality is they are bringing back some safety together with the Mozambique Defense Force. And this is to be commended on military, but checking the lessons and hearing what Professor Erin was saying and Professor Asterius have been saying, it is too soon to claim victories. And we have seen politicians in Iraq and other parts of the world quickly jumping into saying, we have done it, we did it. But look at where those countries are today. So I would say, in terms of interests, no doubt that, and the way and the governance of the deployment, that Rwandese are there to facilitate the LNG processes, and that is something that we would expect. Obviously, billions of dollars were invested there, and banks need to recover that. And I was pleased to hear Professor Erin saying that let us also look at Cabo Delgado, not as she has said, as a resource curse country, but I would say it's a resource curse. So it's a curse even before production started. So while in other countries, in African countries, we see resource curse, where production leads to curse. But in the case of Mozambique, it is indeed a case of a resource curse. So it's a curse even before production started, which is more difficult to deal with. So I think I would come at a later stage, but this is how I look.
Wonderful, Prof. Navunga. Let's bring in Professor McCandless. Professor Navunga refers to what you described. Let me ask you a very direct question. Prof. Navunga has just told us almost explicitly here that it does appear that the Rwandan forces, their objective seems to be clearly around, protecting and securing the resource. Is this an acceptable objective for such a complex counterinsurgency operation that talks to real governance grievances that are unaddressed? Prof. McCandless, do you want to talk us through that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've actually read about the same analysis, right? That Rwanda says its troops are there as long as necessary, and it's expected that they'll eventually create a security zone around Palma and the nearby gas installations. So it's, I mean, that's not obviously a solution designed to inspire hope in, really a lasting political solution, and with an emphasis on, addressing root causes and so forth. I mean, I suppose if we are taking the viewpoint that the military is there to create space, perhaps, that can be part of an objective, but still it seems very limited and unlikely to push the government at all into thinking about, having a more meaningful political solution. So that's what I would say. I'm certainly, I'm not an expert on the SADC and Rwanda element, though, in fact, it is legal. I mean, what Mozambique has done is legal under international law, right? In terms of drawing on another member state to support its activities in countering violent extremism or defending itself. So I think, I understand it's created a lot of sensitivity around the SADC neighborhood. But in fact, we also have to look at the fact that it wanted to take an immediate approach to addressing the solution. And the Rwandans have a pretty good, record sheet of addressing things quite quickly and effectively. So the real key is, how is this going to be effectively tied to a political solution? And, Thomas really a lot of great points. And I think, we all agree that it needs to be a nationally driven solution. Here's really where, the rubber hits the road, but it's also a key challenge, because if there is not enough political will to address the really deep-rooted structural issues, then what is the international community's responsibility? I think that's the real challenging question. And how can international actors support the government, accompany the government without being too dominated, without getting too involved on the ground, and so forth. So I think that's the real, challenge about how we have to try and grapple with this.
Thanks, Prof. McCandless. Let's bring in Professor Mandrup here. You've been, I'm sure, following the conversation. The question that I have for you is that Professor Esterhazy referred earlier on to the time-space ratio factor that we need to consider. But more importantly, I think there's the issue of cost that also has not been factored here. We've heard Prof. Navunga and Prof. McCandless saying that the mandate of the Rwandans is most likely going to be extended. Can Samim also say the same thing? Given the fact that they've indicated initially that it's for about 3 months, can they afford an extended commitment to this counterinsurgency operation? Prof. Mandrup? Yes, go ahead, Prof. Mandrup. I don't know if you heard me. Oh, you didn't hear me. Okay, then we'll then head over then and raise that with Prof. Esterhazy. What's your view, Prof? Do you foresee the Samim mandate being extended, given the complex nature and the cost? You are the one who raises the issue of the time-space ratio. What's your view on this?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because linking costs to the number of forces in the area and linking costs to the need for more forces in the area, it's a difficult question because we actually need much more than what we have in the country at the moment to stabilize the situation. So it's a difficult thing to say yes or no. I, of course, want to say yes, they have to do it because there is a need for more boots on the ground. But, it's also a question of coordination and how do you tie, the Rwandan deployment with the SADC deployment and whether there is coordination, because if there is not coordination and if there is not cooperation, then it may become a counterproductive reality that we are sitting with in terms of the security forces in the province itself. So my suggestion would be that we think very carefully about what all these military groups are supposed to do that. And And that's my biggest worry, as I've pointed out to you, that there's no clear idea what the military ought to achieve in Cabo Delgado. They've been deployed, but what is it that we expect them to do? Because we all know, and this should be clear, we all know that the solution to this problem is a political solution, it's an economic solution. Yes, the security is required for those solutions to unfold, but eventually the solution ought to be a political solution, and the solution ought to be an economic and development solution. So that's precisely, I think, the challenge we are facing. What is it that the military must do to play into that solution so that the military is doing what it's supposed to do, but that the solution translates into a long-term, sustainable political and economic solution for the province?
And given what you've just shared, is it too premature for me to basically ask the question of whether what we're seeing unfolding in Mozambique could be maybe Southern Africa's first intractable conflict, what has been described as a forever war, where because of the commitment, because of the need to maintain security, that SADC and maybe other forces are caught in continuing conflict cycles? Professor Hazy?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that question is tied for me to the whole to the higher order question of what is the kind of insurgency that we are sitting with in Mozambique, and that's the reason why I ask questions about the sustainability of the insurgents in the insurgency campaign that they are busy with. Are we not? And this is a very it may be sounds like a very stupid question to ask, but are we not sitting here with organized violence, with some roots tied to insurgency, but in essence we are sitting with a high level organized violence problem. And there's a huge difference, because if you can deal with organized violence, it's a total different thing than an insurgency. And what I have seen, the crumbling, I almost want to say, of the forces with in reaction to what the Rwandan forces were doing, I'm at a point where I want to say, are we not sitting here with a well-organized crime problem instead of a sustainable insurgency? If that is the case, I think then all these realities that I've talked about can be turned around, and we just leave the security forces to sort them out, and then start with the development and political and economic solutions. Then the comprehensive approach is a sort of something that can sort of come in as a second approach.
Yep. So, Professor McCandless, very fundamental question here. Is this just an organized violence issue that we're faced with? Therefore, if it is organized violence, let's pull out the guns and deal with it at that level as a crime, maybe organized violence issue. Does it necessitate the kind of integrated, long-term, committed governance approaches, I would say, that you seem to be suggesting?
Well, I think no conflict is just an organized crime, or is primarily an organized crime. I think that's a repercussion of war, or also can be a causal factor, but it's usually in this case, I think it's a repercussion of grievances not being met. Yeah. And we know Paul Collier's grievance framework, and I'm certainly more on the side of grievance, right, than greed. Of course, there is greed, and there is, there are conflict entrepreneurs taking place, and there is a war economy that's developed around this. but that's unlikely to develop if there is inclusive, solid development, right? I don't think if we see countries meeting the SDGs, we'll see a lot of organized crime taking place at different levels in a particular country. So I think another person in the comments made the point that gas is a critical national asset. Absolutely it is. But given high states of state fragility, high levels of state fragility, the question is how can Mozambicans ensure that their national resources are properly managed? And this is, a question, perhaps that regional governments can also have a conversation about. Wouldn't be the first, but there are positive examples in the sub-region. Botswana, for example. So I think, we have to definitely look at this question of intractability, but oh gosh, my Siri going off, excuse me. How do I turn it off? Okay. So yeah, I think that is basically what I would say. And I think, transforming the war economy is a tricky issue, but it has to be done through building capacity in governance within the region. Yeah.
I agree.
So, Prof. Novunga, we need really to look at these long-term comprehensive measures, but are there governance frameworks currently in place in Mozambique that can see us adding a factor of accountability into these cycles of state-led corruption, led by security men who have these rent-seeking tendencies in such situations and effectively prey on the local populations? Is that accountability in place, Prof. Novunga?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think I will touch on a couple of points as a way of addressing to your question. And then I will end with whether Mozambique is, or Northern Cabo Delgado is moving towards an intractable kind of conflict. Well, by resource curse, so a curse before production, that means the governance failure, so to say, in relation to the economies around extractivism in Mozambique. So we have, on the one hand, an elite-centric extractivism, which is combined by 30 years of democracy, of non-inclusive governance, non-inclusive growth, and non-inclusive development. Which is underpinned by a political exclusion based on partisanship. Mozambique has been hailed internationally as an example of post-war and democracy. But the reality is the international community needed an example to show. But Mozambique, what was labeled as an example, it was an exclusionary system of governance. So instead of building the state, Frelimo used aid to build the party, the former liberation movement, which has failed to transform itself from the ideology of governing alone to a more democratic, modern systems where it is about really steering different networks of governance and moving towards the fulfillment of the national interest. So national interest was privatized by a group to legitimate a certain agenda. And this, let me give you an example, simple one of what I'm saying, because not to sound too abstract. You know, when we talk about northern Cabo Delgado, take MGP, Mosimbo da Praia, take Palma, all that coastal area, it is an opposition area. It's an opposition area. And because of the politics of exclusion, all those areas, they were not developed. The state was absent there. So when we talk about fragility, it means opposition areas. There is no state. There is no service. The state is not there. And it is from there that violent extremist organization interrupted when resources were discovered and the networks of organized crime. So this tells you how fragile, how governance failed these countries. I would put it this way: governance failed this country, and it is manifesting itself in violent extremism in a way that we are waking up today. We have been neglecting all signs. This is one aspect, but the other aspect of it, you know that today here in Mozambique, there is the trial of those who conspired to take Mozambique to enter into its biggest corruption case, the $2 billion hidden scandal. The center of that scandal, it is the Mozambique Intelligence Service. So they have turned the Mozambique Intelligence Service into a corrupt entity, an entity that was used to fail the Mozambique nation and national interest. So when you have this, you cannot expect other indicator of governance failure than what the intelligence is turned into a weapon of corruption, in a way that it is taken away from its mandate of gathering intelligence as to what is happening, is turned into the instrument of corruption. So this, to me, not only tells you how governance neglected, governance failed the young people of Cabo Delgado. They allowed elites to partner with foreign interests to violate human rights, to abuse those local populations, and more importantly, to deny development to those people in the form of jobs, etc. And so with all this happening, in a much larger context, where, you know, the former liberation movement, Frelimo, is in court today. The former president and the incumbent, they do not look at each other eye on eye. The former president is seated today in the court because his son is being tried for colluding to, and that collusion has resulted in Mozambique's biggest crisis since independence, where millions of children, millions of women, and ordinary Mozambicans have no job because of that problem. And they do not speak to each other. That, it has failed them, taken away the capacity of the state. So to some extent, when you talk, Professor Erin, about political will, you know, this concept of political will, sometimes it is whose political will. So it is sometimes, when you look at the way that Mozambique is addressing what's happening in northern Mozambique, sometimes you question the type of political will, because it is also framed in a context of failing Frelimo, failing governance, and the inability of the country to steer different networks. So you will hear, they say dialogue, no, yes and no. You cannot talk with the violent extremists. Institutions are not working. A dean was there, was created, but not set in the right way in terms of mandate, in terms of positioning, but also in terms of resources and moving forward, etc., and not given the proper job. If you look at how governance is responding to IDPs and how conceptually they are being treated, IDPs, this also tells you what I mean by governance failing. So violent extremism, it results of failed governance, fragility, but the governance of the crisis is also a bit of problem in what we see in northern Cabo Delgado. So in reflections like these ones, we come together to reflect on what's happening, scholarly, gather lessons and influence and shape the discourse, how politicians treat IDPs, how they treat violent extremist organizations, how they look at them. All these, it can benefit of forums like these ones. So this is how I view this and the importance of organizing this today, where we have SADC forces in Mozambique, which until very recently, they were not given the sort of this very same space that Rwanda seems to be having. That's part of particular type of governance.
So, Prof. Nuvunga, before I ask you to wrap up, and thank you, by the way, for that very in-depth understanding or presentation that gives us a sense about what is exactly going on around the state fragility and maybe how a lack of accountability and transparency has driven a lot of the grievances that have led to the violent extremism that we're seeing. But before we come back to you, Prof, to round it off, in sort of no more than about 2 or 3 minutes, I would like to request our 2 other professors, starting with maybe Prof McCandless, to hospital pass there, to maybe give us your final observations. Then we'll go to Prof Esterhuis. Prof McCandless.
Okay, I've been trying to read these long, very wonderful questions, so I haven't gotten through them all. So apologies, because I was also trying to listen to Prof.
Nuvunga.
Wonderful comments that I completely agree with. And yeah, I'll just say I very much agree with it. And the question of whose political will is a really stimulating one, of course. And I think it's a fascinating case, because obviously we've been thinking a lot about polarization in many countries around the world. So I think we are going to have to really focus more on the question of how do we understand deep polarization within society, and in cases where it's driven by elites, which it often usually is, what are the different policy responses in these contexts, and how does that feature in peacekeeping and peacebuilding types of interventions. So it's a really important area of focus. So I had a couple questions just around the social contract and peace, and I didn't quite get through them, but I think it's an important question that was asked by Colin Amiel Chaka. And in particular around, how does it start? What does it look like in a context where there is not perhaps political will, or where the government can't actually even recognize that there are internal causes to this issue rather than just external ones? And that's a very good question. I mean, Mozambique has just negotiated a peace agreement, fairly recently, and to be honest, I haven't studied that, but forging a really resilient and inclusive social contract, at least that's the basis of a lot of my research, has to start with a political settlement that is inclusive or becomes increasingly inclusive. And I think that's one of the main problems we see in Mozambique, is it's a very elite-driven affair and very polarized as well. And so, there has to, this military intervention has to be tied to renegotiating different aspects of the political settlement and ensuring that it becomes much more inclusive and engages, different, a representative element of society. And secondly, this has to be coherently tied to institutions and transitional mechanisms, different mechanisms and institutions. I mean, we researched across 9 countries, and all of them had a failure to kind of link the mechanisms and institutions in terms of implementing provisions of different agreements, right? So there was just a lot of chaos in that area, and the core causes of conflict also were not addressed in all 9 countries, right? So these basic issues that we keep talking about are actually really quite critical in providing a pathway both towards a serious, robust social contract and also towards peace. And thirdly is around social cohesion. The distrust that's in society and distrust of the state is a key factor that motivates young people. Another person asked a question about most of us are young and coming from, predominantly Muslim regions, but there's also a transnational element, as we know. So I think there's a need within Mozambican society, and particularly in Cabo Delgado, to build trust within these institutions. And this, of course, is a difficult issue. It's related to good governance and not just trust, but creating a sense of belonging. And it's also tied to participation. So these are all elements of social cohesion, which is quite complex. But this is a core part of the social contract, and it's iterative. You also need these processes to be working before an inclusive political settlement can actually take hold. And there was another question about peace, but I know I shouldn't take more time, and I didn't have time to fully read it, but I think that, who's interested in peace was one of the key questions. And it's like, well, people are interested in peace, even if elites aren't and government leaders are not. People want peace, and they don't just want what we call a negative peace, which is a silencing of the guns. They want positive peace. They want good governance. They want resources to be, fairly distributed and properly managed. And they want, service delivery to be functioning in fair and effective ways. I mean, that's pretty obvious. We all want that. And that's part of peace. And we also want our relationships to be healthy, and we want to trust. We want to be able to trust one another and the state. Otherwise, let's go somewhere else, right? So I'll end it there, but thank you.
Prof. McCandless, let me just take this opportunity before I hand over to Prof. Esterhazy to thank you for your deep and very insightful interventions today. We really learned a lot from your participation. Prof. Esterhazy, do you think you can do better than that? Oh, you're on mute, sir. You're on mute. You're on mute, Prof. Esterhazy.
Right. While she was talking, while Aaron was talking, I was thinking about the idea of positive peace. It sort of popped up in my mind, and I think there's perhaps three key issues for positive peace. The one is an understanding that we need to create a political solution here, and a political solution by implication should be inclusive, should be trust-driven, should be based on social cohesion, and very important in creating a political solution, it should be governance-driven and not security-driven. That's the only way that we will create positive peace. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that you can only develop and create positive peace if you build the institutions of government. And we will have to focus in a comprehensive manner on the building of government institutions. And it ties with the third and last point that I want to make, that our previous speaker also alluded to, and that is that you can't build positive and sustainable government bureaucracies if you are sitting with the problem of corruption. And it.
Oh dear, we seem to have lost our feed with Professor Esther. He was making some fantastic points. If he does come back, we'll try and bring him back up again. But let me just take this opportunity to also thank Professor Esther for his participation, and apologies for his unplanned departure. So, my brother, Prof. Novunga, we are now at that stage where I'd really appreciate it if you could sort of wrap it up for us in that fantastic way that you do, and maybe then close the seminar for us. Over to you, Prof.
Well, thank you very much, my brother Chris, for this wonderful seminar today. What I wanted to say, number one, is that we will continue this series of regional events, and will be combined with more national events here in Mozambique. This is the first. Second one is that this series of regional events, of webinars and workshops, it's really important to continue building awareness about the situation in Mozambique and northern Mozambique in particular. The risk of regional spillover is real, as violent extremist organization is under pressure militarily in northern Cabo Delgado. They can seek safety in other parts of Africa. So it's important to continue with a regional approach, and at the very same time tackling the military intervention from the governance perspective and good governance perspective. Transparency, accountability of the military intervention is key, particularly with respect to non-combatants, with respect to human rights, including the protection of women and children. The overall approach is, from our perspective, is on one hand ensure that there is a military accountability, which is embedded in overall approach of dialogue for solution to the conflict in northern Mozambique. This dialogue is threefold. One is in relation to IDP, is in relation to local communities. We can talk about governance, but that will be meaningless if we are not empowering local communities to meaningfully participate in governance, particularly in the governance of the ongoing extractivism. Number two is how Cabo Delgado, as a regional government, can have the opportunity to meaningfully participate in Mozambique's political economy of extractivism. There are examples from other parts of Africa where regions have a say. If you look at the Mozambique's model of monetization, it is all Maputo-centered. And Mozambique has no experiences of sharing resources with provinces. Corruption is undermining that. So how that can be improved from a governance perspective. And third is how the international community, including international private sector, can meaningfully participate and contribute for building institutions, but more importantly, development, to give jobs for local people and build resilience to communities. Most often, private sector, they say it's not our job. But that is it's an old-fashioned way of extractivism. In the modern days, international oil companies, they have to be part and parcel of local development and people-centered strategies of local development for a sustainable way of doing business and addressing human rights. By human rights, we are taking a more inclusive concept which goes beyond abuses and violations to tackle the right to development, the right to development of local communities. So to you, brothers from the global north, it is no longer about extractivism, piping and go. No, it's about a dialogue-based model of local development and doing business, where local communities, they are considered as not as locals, but they are taken as part of the business model. It's only this way that we can address violent extremism, we can build resilient communities and peace, and business contribute for a more human development. I would leave it here. We will continue with this. Thank you very much, my brother Chris. Thank you very much to GGA. Thank you very much to Mail and Guardian for this wonderful webinar today. To Professor Erin, Professor Ashton, to all colleagues here. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I hand it over back to you, Chris, for that final word of closing. Thank you very much, my brother.
Thank you so much, Brother Adriano. Always fantastic listening to you, and indeed to all of our participants today. We have been monitoring and observing your contributions to the chat, that is to our audiences, and we will make attempts to compile these questions and respond to them in a forthcoming seminar or webinar report that we will be producing shortly. So on behalf of the CDD and GGA, I hope you have a very pleasant afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.